Well, welcome back. This morning we had an overview on Bowen theory with Louise talking about the practical application. So my part of this is to sort of go back and how did this start? Dr. Kerr mentioned a little bit about Dr. Bowen's research project at NIMH. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the time we have. It's been my interest for the past 5 years. The Bowen family donated some of his papers to the National Library of Medicine in 2002, and there are other parts of the collection that they're trying to get together. So it's been my interest to sort of go up there in advance of some of the meetings that they had at the Family Center and really look at these papers. The interest I had was, how did family psychotherapy get started? What happened to lead Dr. Bowen to make the shift? You know, he was trained as an analyst and managers for many years, and just what went into this. There are clinical aspects of the papers, but the collection is pretty big, so I really focused in on just that part. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So this talk sort of starts at the beginning. And if you deal with psychotherapy, of course, it starts here. It really didn't start with Sigmund Freud. I think those of you who are historians know that Freud first was a hypnotist, and they had sort of a whole nother history. But if you're looking for a place where psychotherapy started, especially with an interest in the affective nature of provider-doctor-patient relationship, this is it. Also, a little bit about history. This is the couch. If you go to London, to Freud's house, he moved there in 1938. Many of his friends, fortunately, had enough money to pay the Gestapo, and they boxed up everything he had, moved it to London. It's a very nice house. And so this is the couch. And there was somebody ahead of us in line. Of course, his daughter lived there. Maybe I should have brushed up on my history of the Freud family. I don't know if Anna was the youngest or the oldest. I have in my mind she was the oldest, but I could be wrong. She had an office in another part of her house. Dr. Freud lived about a year and then died. She never used her father's office. And there was somebody in line ahead of us, and the woman was saying, well, his office is a lot bigger. Why doesn't she use that? And I was thinking to myself, I don't think we quite understand family emotional process. So here's the couch. And I also had a lot of friends in the Air Force who just had nothing in their office. And they always used to tell me, well, we're analytically oriented and it has to be a blank slate. We don't want any pictures, diplomas, nothing. The family has to be all white. And I kind of held on to that. Then I journeyed to this, and it's full of stuff. So something got lost in the translation. But anyway, if you're in London, you can make a pilgrimage. It's in a nice part of London. And there's the couch. But I think from 1954 to 1959, the Super Bowl was at Bowen's NIMH project. I was going to alter this slide, but both my schools, Michigan and Wisconsin, did not do well in playoffs. So we're up to this. But I think that's it. So this was a 4-year project, and I'll have a little bit, obviously, more to say about that. Here's a picture of Dr. Bowen that I took. It hangs in his office at the Family Center. One of the things I was taught in graduate school was, and I still use, you have to sort of start broadly and then come down to sort of one narrow point. And in articles, of course, that's translated. Those of you who are in school or still writing articles, you know the last sentence has to be, and the purpose of this is to. So you have to start broadly and sort of focus down. And that's what we're going to do today. There were 2 workshops that Dr. Bowen and his colleagues did at the end of the project. One was in 1958, the other one was in 1959, but it was not published until 1961. I call them, this is not his term, it's my term, capstone workshops, because all the presenters, people who worked on the project, he and 2 other psychiatrists, and there was a clinical social worker. They all wrote papers and they all presented. So I think these are 2 unique workshops that came near the end. The workshop in 1958, we have 1 paper that has survived, which is Dr. Bowen's. The interesting thing, of course, there's always surprises about archives and history. So I can't find as yet the other papers. But the really nice surprise about this first workshop was that, for whatever reason, and I'm glad they did, they took along a stenographer. And so all the comments of the audience were transcribed, which I think is, so here you have 35 pages, single-spaced, of all these comments. Here's Virginia Satir making her comments as well as other notable people. So we have that. The second workshop, again, presented in 1959 after the project ended, not published in 1961. The Family's Unit of Study and Treatment. These are the papers that were in that workshop. Dr. Bowen led off with family psychotherapy. For those of you who are familiar with his book, that's chapter 5. But part of, was something lost in translation because there were part of the paper that he published here that did not appear in the book. And here are the other papers. Dr. Deisinger, Family Perspective on the Diagnosis of Individual Members. Deisinger was a psychiatrist, but he served as the family physician for all the people on the project for the last 3 years, which I think is very, very interesting. The first year, somebody had a problem, sent him to the pediatrician on NIMH. So he was the physician for the project. Dr. Brody, a little bit different theoretical orientation, that's his paper. And Betty Basmania, she was the clinical social worker, so this was her paper. But today we're going to concentrate on Dr. Bowen's paper and Betty Basmania. So we're down to the narrow part of the funnel. So the purpose is to sort of talk about these 2 papers and then talk about some points that I think these generate. So here's the first paper by Dr. Bowen. Now some of this is not in his book. Probably maybe an editor decision. I guess I'm looking at you as an editor, but who knows? I mean, why things are clipped out, whatever. Fortunately, we have it. So for those of you who don't know about the project, or even some of those who do, I think this is a really good summary in 100 words or less about what he did. So let's go through it. Project first focused on the intense symbiotic relationship between mothers and patients, children diagnosed as schizophrenics. 3 mothers live on the ward with the patient. Theoretical thinking regarded this intense interdependency as a phenomenon of the mother-patient relationship. Each mother and patient had individual psychotherapy on the premise that this would permit each to mature and grow away from the other. Clinical observation of this living together situation provided data that had not been anticipated from previous clinical work with mothers and patients separately. There were observations that suggest that the psychological bonds between mother and patient were more complex than anticipated, and the phenomenon was not confined to the mother-patient relationship. The fathers also played an important part in it, and it could involve multiple family members. It seemed more accurate to think of this as a single family problem that could have involved multiple family members than multiple smaller discrete problems. After 1 year, the thinking was incorporated into the family unit hypothesis. Briefly stated, they considered the psychosis in the patient to be a symptom manifestation in one person of an active process that involved the entire family. The research plan was changed to one that permitted fathers, mothers, schizophrenic patient, and normal siblings to live together on the ward. The psychotherapy plan was changed to one in which family members attended all psychotherapy hours together. Pretty good summary. So you have the first year of the project when they're kind of orienting their way through this. Sort of this observation is made by dealing with these families 24/7 and then a shift is made to the family as a unit of treatment and study for the last 3 years of the project. So there's really 2 phases. One of the things that's interesting about historical materials, probably current things too, simple things, you think it would be simple to identify, well, how many people are involved in this? You know, in school, everybody wants to know what the sample size is, who did what. And what I'm finding, and also a colleague who also works in this, Catherine Rackow, it's hard to pin this down. Here's chapter 2 in his book. This chapter, Role of the Father and the Schizophrenic Member. They talk about 10 families. Here's chapter 3. They talk about 10 families. Here's chapter 4. 2 numbers are mentioned, N of 14, N of 11. Chapter 6, which deals with outpatient family therapy. FTCP is family therapy in clinical practice. That's Dr. Bowen's book. 20 families. In Dr. Bowen's paper, the one we're talking about, workshop done in 1959, it was published in 1961, he says there are 18 families. You read Betty Basmania's paper, she said 11. So, he has a nice section in the introduction that does not appear in the book. It's the clearest that he talked about in terms of how many people were there. So we talked about there were 2 phases of this, individual phase and the last 3 years. There were 3 mother-daughter units in the individual phase. They were selected basically on who had the most intense relationship. The stickiness between both of them, not who had the worst schizophrenic symptoms. Second year on, 2 mother-patient families from the first phase continue for 25 and 36 months respectively. So right away we have a shift. That always takes me back in terms of length of stay. How did they do this? 36 months? And they certainly weren't blaming mothers or parents, or they wouldn't have stayed, but that to me is always stunning. How did they do this? So this gives you a sense, and what he said was 7 families of parents, patients, normal siblings, etc. represented the core material for the project. Average length of stay is about a year. But then there were 8 families followed as outpatients for 30 months, 12 more families followed as outpatients. So his end is 18. But then I'm a person who I love footnotes. I live for footnotes. Here's this little footnote at the bottom of one of the early pages of the article. The numbers reported in individual papers are different depending on the number with whom each author had individual experience. Makes sense, but I think it's an area needing further investigation. The project is now closed while they work out the details of some of the clinical things with this. And when it reopens, that's going to be one of my goals, to go back and really track this down. But this is the clearest summary that I found about just how many numbers they had. So here's his paper on family psychotherapy. Again, hypothesis based on the experiences with schizophrenic patients and their parents at Menninger's. He was there for many years, I think 1946 until the project started. So he wasn't at Menninger's for a 6-month quickie workshop, and then he left and went somewhere else. His interest in this started there. He hospitalized families there, so it didn't start in this project. There's a member of the Murray Bowen Archives Project who has made it her quest to go back to Menninger's. Of course, they moved from Topeka down here to Houston, and those papers are sequestered somewhere in, I don't know, underground caverns or something, and she's going to make it her quest to see if they can uncover those patient records, to see if anything were written about the experiences that generated his interest in this. So we'll have to stay tuned for that. The basic character problem on which the psychotic symptoms were later imposed was considered to be an unresolved symbiotic attachment to the mother. That's the stickiness between the two. That's how the people were selected. This is one of my favorite quotes that I like too. It's an arrest in normal psychological growth initiated by by the infant's response to the emotional immaturity of the mother, which neither wanted and against which both have struggled unsuccessfully over the years. I think really good summary. I went too fast. Your clicker is good. The emotional oneness between the mother and patient was more intense than expected. That was an understatement, because if you read the early papers in the first year, it was to such an extent and impacted the staff that it threatened the very existence of the project. These are not easy families 24/7 to deal with. Individual psychotherapy just sort of restored harmony with the oneness, but it didn't promote differentiation. That's why eventually it was stopped. So after the second year, the hypothesis was changed to the family's unit of treatment approach. And so family psychotherapy started here and was derived from the concept. If you believe that all these are connected up and the family is an emotional unit, then you have to treat the unit. You can't treat individuals in the unit. But there was no precedent for that. The model was, and still is, the individual model. So the concept is simple and obvious and subtle and complex, which I think is true. I think of that with the little psych hospital we have in our town, and I wondered if this concept would have stuck and you had some parent take in a kid who was risky and doing a lot of things, and the person at the admissions desk said, well, I think they meet criteria because she's cutting on herself, but we do things a little differently here, so mom and dad, go home and pack a bag and come back with her. You can room with her. Wouldn't that be something? So here's his little blurb about family psychotherapy. It's directed to the emotional oneness, this symbiosis between the two. Psychotherapy based on individual theory directed to a group of individuals. The same family would be family group psychotherapy, which is different from family psychotherapy that he involved. He took great pains in his writing to distinguish this from individual therapy, from group therapy, other kinds of things, to make it very clear what it was and what it wasn't. There are also 3 levels of awareness of this. An intellectual awareness is easy to understand. We've all taken multiple choice tests in school as either undergraduate or graduate students. Murray Bowen is interested in the concept of family emotional, A, B, C, D. People get that, and I think they understand it on an intuitive level. Intellectually, you can grasp it. A clinical understanding of this, my best way of categorizing this, I thought of this with 2 of my children who were on swim team and did some diving. I think the degree of difficulty is 10. You recall, 10 out of 10 is a high score. It's difficult to put this into operation clinically. The individual orientation predominates, and a significant effort is required to make the shift. Some people can do this in their head. They know about the mental health language in DSM, or we're going to have DSM-5 shortly. But they also are pretty well grounded on the family part of this as well. And I think it's difficult to make the shift. What's even harder is an emotional awareness. The degree of difficulty is 12 by my rating. You have to shift from the emotional identification with the individual to an emotional awareness of the family unit. Not easy. And the ability to manage over-identification with one person or alternating identifications with people. Not easy. An awareness of family problems enhanced by emotional attachment from individuals. I'll say a little bit about that later. In his paper, he was interested in broad patterns of behavior. You heard Dr. Kerr address some of these, the idea of the emotional divorce. These are patterns they picked out repeatedly in these families. I think they were doing single case experimental designs before the term was popular. Over-adequate, inadequate reciprocity, under-normal functioning, interdependent triad, the early name for what became the triangle. So here's his definition of the therapeutic relationship. Initial goal is to get the family unit into a continuing relationship with the therapist in which the family members intend to work together in the hour to discuss and define their own problems. If you look at the, I think think it's a textbook on psychoanalysis that Glenn Gabbard has put together. The last definition in the glossary is working through. I think this is related to that. They work toward a position of unbiased attachment from which he's able to analyze the interfamily forces. If we think of the family as a single organism, the situation has certain analogies to the structure of psychoanalysis. Come back. The family working together is similar to the patient who is free to associate. The therapy effort is to analyze existing interfamily relationships in situ, a term borrowed, which I know well from my days as an archaeologist and anthropologist, rather than to analyze the transference relationship between the patient and the analyst. When the therapist is successful in relating to the family unit and avoiding individual relationships, which is key, then the family develops dependence on the therapist similar to neurotic transference, which is unlike the intense primitive attachment of a psychotic patient to a therapist. Recall that Bowen was trained as an analyst. He appreciated this. He knew about the emotional involvement that he had with his patients. So, one phase of this is searching for a family leader. Dr. Kerr mentioned this too about families being helpless with high levels of anxiety. And so the goal was to find a leader and a leaderless family. So who's the spokesman for the family? He also recognized individuals went through a process of differentiation of self from other family members. That was mentioned in this paper. Recall that it was done in 1961. So this term comes on the scene as well. And the family leaders, of course, it's not surprising, were the first to work on differentiation of self. So here's Betty Bass-Manian's paper. Here's her summary. The project offered an apt framework for the study of emotional life of the family unit for the development of approach to the unit. Theoretical orientation regarding schizophrenic problems as part of the process involving the family. Systematic observation of family units were consistent with the hypothesis. Treatment based on these observations were adapted to the unit. So, they wrote these separately, but it's interesting how they dovetail. So these were her observations. Again, social casework was a term used in that time. And recall that when I said they had traditional treatment of these families for the second year on, they treated them as a group by having daily staff family meetings. And so, I can imagine what that's like. All these people who were doing individual therapy from an analytic perspective were out of job and had to do something else. And there was no roadmap on what to do. The observations were made as a result of seeing the family's unit would have been much less clear, if not obscured, if the members were seen individually. Most of us, of course, are clinicians, or if you see families at all, you have one presentation, if one person's there, you get another, if you can broaden the vision a little bit. And when families are seen together, they often turn to experts for the answers. Of course, that's true now. It wasn't just true in the 50s. People lay down and they want an answer. Tell me what to do, doctor. I can't talk to my child, and I'm bringing them to you so that you can talk to them. And working with the family requires a shift from individual problems among the family members. Working with the family unit, and she's very clear on this, not that Dr. Bowen isn't, that if you work with the family unit, it significantly alters the therapeutic relationship. Big shift to do that. And that you can't have one-to-one relationships with family members and have effective therapy. And a high degree of self-awareness was needed for the therapist to maintain an objective position. They both said that. Other findings she had that transference and countertransference are present in therapy with the family unit, but can be diluted. I was thinking of that term in the days when we were doing Kool-Aid for the kids, and you pour the Kool-Aid into the water, and it changes color. I guess Kool-Aid, well, we don't have kids at home anymore. I guess Kool-Aid is sort of on the outs. But anyway, Dr. Bowen's word for this was transference was lessened. It was reduced. And of course, countertransference is present, but that is also diluted if you shift the focus to families' emotional unit. Let's see here. All right. So the family unit approach solves common problems. You get dilution and transference. The natural dependence on children on parents is kept intact. Parents not threatened when their child is seen individually. And it also solves the problem, which still goes on because I hear this all the time. Family comes in or the kid comes in, who's going to see who? We'll see the child, we'll see mom, we'll see dad. And so you have this multiple therapeutic team that sort of attacks this family. Working this way, you don't have it. So what are some, to kind of end up, just practice implications from these things? Clinical and emotional awareness of family's unit are major obstacles still. Intellectual awareness is key. Managing over-involvements with one family member, alternating involvements is challenging, remains challenging. Search for the family leader is important. I think that's overlooked. Of course, Dr. Bowen would say avoid content, focus on process. And these were sort of the nuts and bolts of the treatment that they did. Some of the prominent things. Summarizing the consultation, he had the families do that at the end of the session. If the providers did it, then the family would wait until 5 minutes before the hour and sit there for wisdom, ready to take notes on what the person would say. He had the families do it. And this concept of emotional attachment, to me, I think is misunderstood. It's detachment from individuals to a focus on the family unit. It's not uncaring or distance dislike of people. And look for triangles with parents and children versus a focus on the symptomatic child. And the benefits of this, the family's unit concept is just what Betty Besmania said, the natural dependence on children and their parents are not disturbed, parental anxiety is not increased since the child is not seen. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
By that clock, you've got 2 minutes.
Anybody have any questions in the last 2 minutes?
A 2-minute comment or question?
Comment, question? Dr. Miller.
In your research, did you discover at all the configuration of how people slept in the hospital? I mean, did the parents like have a room together?
I think everybody had.
Each of the
Everybody,
siblings?
they let the families do that. My perception is that each family had their own room. They could decorate it however they wanted. We do have a detailed description of that because there was a mother who was a writer, wrote a book by the name of Our Son Ken. Half the book is devoted about her reactions to being in Bowen's project. She didn't name that, but it's very clear where she was. Plus, I found her case to document it. And she talks about the living arrangements. They had U-Haul trailer moved and stuff to make it like home. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Dr. Butler, thank you. I've been looking forward to that, and it is fascinating to hear the ideas take shape and the implications for them. Thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Peter Steinke, who's making his way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
I have a deteriorating disc created by arthritis, so just in case I need some support, I'm using this lectern. Before I begin, I want to thank Victoria for all of her time and effort, and also using her resources to put this event together. We appreciate what you've been doing for us. My initial encounter with Bowen theory came through an op-ed piece I read 40 years ago. The writer Sidney Harris told the story of an evening stroll with a Quaker friend down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. In the Windy City, one can still find newsstands. This particular evening, Harris's friend purchased a newspaper from the newsie. As they resumed their walk together, Harris noted how rude and grumpy the tender of the stand had been. To which his Quaker friend said, "He's that way every night." Harris then asked his friend why he continued to purchase the paper at that newsstand. His friend said, "Why should I allow his behavior to determine mine?" Now, I clipped this out, and I still have it in a file folder, because at the same time, I was the youth minister at a large church in the suburbs of Chicago. Now, my predecessor had converted the old church building into a coffee house. But he left just as the coffee house had become a favorite watering hole for cyclists from the inner city. This was not the crowd the church had intended to serve. From the moment I arrived, many wanted their lights removed. I had never been told about this situation prior to coming to this congregation, only that they had a great youth program and a phenomenal coffee house ministry. I had no problems with the bikers, but the majority of the power brokers in the church did. So here I am wanting to make a good early impression on people, caught in a bind between bikers and members. Is it any wonder I cut out Harris's article? Behind all of this is that I am the third of 6 children, separated by 15 years, actually to the day. The oldest and youngest born on August the 20th. I had 2 older brothers, one 4 years older and the other 2 years older. From the time I had consciousness, I remembered that I wanted to go where they went, do what they did, be like them. The upside of this was that you always need an extra body for a football or baseball game, so I got to play with the big boys. The downside was that I had become a dogged follower. At Christmas time, I was finishing this presentation, and I was watching our 3 grandchildren, 6 years old, 5 years old, and 3 years old, separated by 4 years. And I was wondering if I could see in this a little microcosm of my own early experience. I noticed that the 3-year-old had to go where the others went, wanted to be like them, and was the dogged follower. On occasion, he would pick up his 2 plastic dinosaurs and create his own version of Jurassic Park. There was a little bit of separateness in some there. I have known for a long time that part of my growth has involved not letting other people's behavior determine mine. So when I defended the cyclist coming to the coffee house, I lost the approval of many. Later, I found comfort in Bowen's assertion that pseudo-self is created by emotional pressure, and it can be modified by emotional pressure. And I wonder if I have become involved as an interventionist with churches in conflict as a way to modify my behavior in a new form of emotional pressure. Further, he marked that there's enough of the imposter in all of us. Wanting approval from others, I learned, is acquired at the behest of the relationship system, but it can be changed. I stayed as associate pastor in this large suburban church for only 20 months. Then I went to graduate school. But that created another problem. I had a wife, 3 children, I had liquidated all of my debt, and I only had a small amount of money to pay for graduate school. My colleague said, well, why don't you ask some people to be your patron, to support you? I said, I can't do that. He said, why not? I said, because I'm German. You get for what you work for. You don't get things free. 15 years later, I am now the director of clergy care My prime responsibility is to be a therapist for Lutheran clergy and members of their families in the state of Texas, a position I held for 14 years. No sooner had I begun this work than I discovered that most of the clergy who were coming to see me were working on not letting other people's behavior determine theirs. In my first year, I read about the research project completed by Drew Divinity School in Madison, New Jersey. The faculty had changed the curriculum 5 years earlier to meet the new demands being placed on their graduates. They inquired about whether or not the new curriculum had helped clergy who had graduated the last 5 years. To their surprise, they discovered the curriculum change was insignificant because most of the recent graduates spent the first 3 to 5 years gaining people's approval. Soon after this research, another field of study came to my attention, done by the Hartford Seminary Foundation, which said that the ecumenical variable among clergy is their dislike of conflict. Of some interest was the fact that graduates of Bible college fared better with conflict than seminary graduates upon entering the ministry field. I wondered if seminary professors were collusive in the avoidance of conflict later demonstrated in their academic offspring. But as director of clergy care, one bishop said, "Would you please work with a congregation here that's in conflict? It's one of our most important congregations." I really had no desire or stomach for the work, but I thought I'd try it. I don't think I was very successful, so I was hesitant the second time I was asked. But then I was asked the third time. And as I said, I am German. I'm stubborn. How do you crack this nut? So I have now worked with 207 congregations over the years. I was helped immensely by two comments, one from Ed Friedman and the other from Kathy Weissman. They freed me up to do this work. The phrase from Dr. Friedman is this: you must give people the freedom not to learn from their own experience. You must give people the freedom not to learn from their own experience. By being able to do that, you don't have anxiety about the system or about the results of the system. Kathy Weissman said to me, "Pete, remember when you do this work that you are the client." I understood her saying to me, my ability to regulate self and my ability to negotiate the triangles in which I would be a part of. Because just by being an interventionist in a conflicted church, you walk into a triangle, was what she was saying to me. So here I am, working with churches in conflict. Not exactly having been prepared for that, but falling into it, but maybe consciously, maybe not consciously, trying to work on not allowing people's behavior to determine mine. I've learned a number of important things in working with systems that are anxious. Number one, structure corrals anxiety. It doesn't dissolve it, it doesn't disseminate it, but structure corrals it. It gives you a chance to deal with the system because the anxiety is not spewing all over the place. I was working with Grace Episcopal Church in New York City. And I have never wanted, during this process, to have a session of vent your spleen, get it off your chest. We've already had enough exercise of the lower brain. Why reinforce it with this kind of procedure? But this church insisted that there were about 80 Gen Xers in the congregation that the rector had brought into the church, and then the rector had now resigned, and they needed to talk to somebody. So I invented a process called Tell It to Peter, in which it was structured. You have 2 minutes to talk, but you must talk to me. You cannot accuse, blame, or scold. And the audience cannot hiss, boo, cheer, and even if you have Pentecostal background, say amen. It had to be at the intellectual level, not the feeling level. Secondly, I discovered that clarity is not always comforting in anxious systems. I said to my wife not too long ago, I still have this crazy position in which people hire me to listen to them and the anxiety in the system, and then to feed back to them what I have heard. And I do that. And when I do it, they get pissed at me. And you all know that when you don't like the message, you go after the messenger. By the way, Churchill once said, nothing in life is more exhilarating than to be shot at and missed. But make sure you're missed. Third, I learned that I am not going to take responsibility for this process. I was working with a church in Houston. There was an attorney who did not want the congregation to hire me. And he asked, what is your rate of success? And I said, I'm glad you asked. My rate of success is 100% because I contracted to a process and I completed. Now, if you're interested about the success of the congregations making functional changes, it's far less than 100%. But it depends on the maturity and the motivation of the leaders. Third, I have learned that when people are anxious and the intensity rises, their expectation that you will provide the answer or the solution increases. There's a person here in this audience who has had experience of this, where I was asked to describe the emotional system of this particular group, and I did. And the first question, after I gave my perspective on what was happening, was, what if there's nothing here that tells us what to do? And when I hear more and more people that tell us how to do, it indicates that the anxiety is incredibly high. Fourth, I do know that how I handle myself in the midst of the anxiety does to some degree have an impact on the process itself. I remember asking Ed Freeman once if I should work with this church that was highly conflicted, and his advice was, if you're anxious about it, don't. If you can deal with your anxiety, do. And that was a great piece of advice. Now, having done 207 interventions, in fact, Sunday, I give my 207th report to a Unitarian church in Kansas City. I have in every one of my reports, as one of the presenting problems, an unclear mission, or what I also call mission drift. People get involved in what they're doing and forget what it's all about. And I'm wondering if a system is to be healthy, functional, if there isn't also something about a social definition, not just self-definition. If the organism itself hasn't at least defined who it's going to be or how it's going to be, it will not function extremely well. Now, that's important because the church I'm working with on Sunday is a historic Unitarian church, and one of its former ministers was actually the author of the Humanist Manifesto. There's a strong secular humanism in this parish. However, the church has been growing from 200 members to 600 members in the last 20 years. And now, many of the newcomers are deists. Or as somebody said, we have a real controversy here between the secular humanist and the fuzzy theist. And it's also symptomatic in that when they did a survey of their ministerial search, 75% want an intellectual leader, yet 67% also want a spiritual leader. And they're wondering if those two are at all compatible. But folks are now fighting over whether they're going to remain more humanist or are they going to allow this spiritual stuff that comes in. Because many of the new members come out of old liberal Protestant backgrounds and want to light candles and even wouldn't mind having a few scriptures read. But this has aroused so much anxiety among the old timers, which then was expressed when the interim pastor came and she became the lightning rod for all of this. Now, when I work with an anxious system, I always work with the most motivated people that I can. I don't try to work with those who find disgust in the system or label the system dysfunctional. Who there is motivated? In Murray Bowen's book, Family Therapy and Clinical Practice, whenever I have questions about the theory, I always go back to the King James Version. Okay? and this is really interesting because he wrote, society's emotional reactiveness in dealing with societal problems is similar to the years of slow buildup of an emotional breakdown in a family. When the first symptom appears, the family either ignores it or does enough to relieve the immediate symptom, considering the problem to be solved. Then, they continue the usual course until another more serious symptom, which is followed by another superficial effort to relieve the symptom. The process keeps repeating until the final breakdown, which is seen as having developed unexpectedly. This is a description of churches in conflict. It's very hard for them to see how the present problem has antecedents in the past, in terms of how people have functioned with one another and how the relationship system has been formed. Now, it's very difficult to work with some of these systems because there's very little intellect at the moment. I sometimes said I must be the left prefrontal cortex pro tem for these people, so don't catch their anxiety, so that you can at least have some objectivity. And remember that even though you feel you've been very objective in your reporting, not everybody's going to like it. In fact, I do realize that as people read the report and see that they have lost control or are not getting what they want, begin to sabotage me. So I don't worry about the sabotage anymore because at least it's a symptom that I'm doing fairly good work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be receiving. But it also means that it would be very easy for me to get caught up with the anxiety that I see in this sabotage. Not too long ago, a man came up and he waved my report in front of me, and he said, "We never had this problem until we had this report." And I said, "Thank you." Another man said, "Since we had this report, things have gotten worse." I said, "Well, sometimes that happens." I can do interventions with churches now fairly well. In fact, I do much better with churches than at home. I'm not as emotionally invested. Okay? And I understand that my role is there to help to do an intervention into the system and to help the system take a look at itself. Because without awareness, without the capacity, as Dr. Kerr said, for self-reflection, there's no chance to have choice. And there will be no change in the functioning of the group. No awareness, no choice. I will not deceive you and say every time I go into a congregation I feel fully comfortable. I always have a little edge of anxiousness there. But I think that's also part of being able to see oneself better, in that the anxiety will be there, but it doesn't control letting other people's behavior to determine mine. We have a few minutes for questions.
You do. You do. You've got 10 minutes.
I would like to ask a favor of you. I am deaf in my left ear, so you would speak loudly. I'd appreciate it.
I think I can do that.
Wonderful.
Actually, what I'd ask you to do is that last line you had said about my role, and I didn't quite catch what you said about to help do an intervention into the system. Could you repeat what you said?
I don't remember what I said. I was there to do the intervention, not to solve the problem.
Okay.
I often say to the congregation, you know, the reason you have hired me to help you not waste your suffering. Because the chances are very great that if you don't change your function in this relationship system, you'll repeat the behaviors.
What page did you quote?
Bowen? Stay with me a second, I'll find it. Go ahead, next question. Victoria?
Dr. Steinke.
It's in King James Version 273.
Thank you.
I'm really interested. It sounded to me, I heard a distinction. I heard you making a distinction between sabotage and the change back reaction that can occur in a family or some systems to a step toward differentiation of self. And not that they would require anything different of you in terms of not reacting back, but I just wondered about your thinking. Did I hear you correctly? And would you say-
I'm not following you, Victoria, so would you put it another way?
Oh gosh, well,
You heard me say,
I heard you distinguish between the sabotage and the potential for the sabotage as a reaction in the system to change.
I would,
And the change back reaction that can also occur. Are they the same, or are they different?
no, for me, they're the same.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
okay.
You know, you did raise something that's very fascinating. In 28 of my last 34 interventions, there's a new presenting problem. And that is, I just call it the change process. That the change process has taken place, but either the clergy have been very naive, or the people weren't ready for it. Or if they do a change, it's based on preference and one's agenda. And what I have discovered is that change is resisted less in an emotional system if it's connected to mission. I think it would also be true if it's connected to principles and it's connected to beliefs, not just change that's ad hoc.
Well, my head was going in a different direction.
All right, go
than
ahead.
yours with your comment, and I'm going to keep thinking about it. I'm going to think about the differences, potential differences, between a sabotage process in a system and the change back reaction.
Uh-huh.
It just occurred to me they may not be the same, and both can occur. Not sure I'm going to stick with that, but thank you for provoking the thought.
Thank you.
If you would go to the mic, please. We're taking and keeping that touch.
You mentioned in congregations finding people who are most highly motivated to change. Are there any clues as to who those people are? I mean, what do you look for, other than maybe them just saying verbally? I mean, what are the signs of somebody who's really highly motivated in a congregation for change?
I look for people who don't blame, who take responsibility for their own behavior, people who will acknowledge that we do have difficulties and the situation does need attention. Those are some of the things. And especially people who don't have to have certainty. They can live with a little ambiguity and ambivalence for the moment till we move towards that process and get that clarity. It takes time to get there. But many anxious systems just want things right now. Part of the anxiety is, give us the answer now, solution. And that's why I do the process over 2 to 4 months. I cannot go too far past 4 months as far as my role, because people will get tired, people lose interest, But I can't do it in a month, and I will never do it in a month, because people don't have enough capacity to be in the thinking brain. There's still so much down that anxious, emotional brain. Yeah. So I do need time. Time helps to get to that point.
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the larger pool of anxiety in which a church often sits. I'm United Methodist, so we are well connected up to our hierarchy and back down again. But it seems to me that congregations sit in a larger church body, and that we have an awful lot of church bodies that are very, very anxious.
A congregation is a subsystem of a larger denominational structure. And your congregation should also be part of a conference, which is a regional basis. And denominations are all anxious today because they're declining in numbers and declining in worship. And we're grasping, every denomination is grasping for something to put an end to this. But the anxiety at the higher level certainly has affected the local level, and vice versa, by too, also, both ways, yes. Louise?
Thank you for many ideas, but I'm wondering, in these churches where you get a responsive someone, I would say leaders, what percentage of those go on to work on differentiation in their own lives?
It's a very good question. I've never done that kind of research, but I do realize that I was in 3 very intense systems where 3 individuals stood out and said, the pastor needs to resign. And 95% of the congregation was opposed to them. I mean, they were well differentiated. And the one thing I noticed about all 3 was they owned their own business. And I think, they had to, at some capacity, to be able to define themselves, stay connected, and make also difficult decisions. But that was the only variable I could see. But they were fairly well differentiated people. Yeah. But I don't know what percentage people go on afterwards. I do not know. I just had a recent experience. I was in the Atlanta airport, and a guy came in, he pulled my elbow, and he says, "Hi, I just wanted to say hello to the Triangle Man." He had just been at a workshop I had done 3 or 4 weeks ago, and had heard me talk about triangles. So at least they hear something of the theory, okay? And I will say this, many, many people are so appreciative of hearing the theory. Finally, I have a little way to understand and conceptualize what's going on when people come together, and the role of anxiety. Yes.
Dr. Steinke, a delightful presentation. Thank you. I do some consultation with 2 churches in Austin, Texas. And I'm reminded of thinking about any organization as somewhat like a child-focused family. So one of the presenting problems that was handed me was a director of youth activities. The turnover was unbelievable. I almost never lasted a year. And I got to asking some questions with a man who was highly motivated. I'm not going to mention the church denomination, but the children that he was in charge of, some of them would be unhappy. They'd go home, dump their anxiety in the family. The parents would go to the minister. And the minister, anxious about income, anxious about how the congregation would see him, would wind up dismissing the youth minister. And talk about, again, difficulty in shifting a system where the differentiation level of the person at the top is not the highest, becomes incredible. And I wonder if you'd ever run into anything
I'm
like
so
that.
sorry. I'm going to have to defer the comment to the discussion in the panel.
Then I can talk to him.
Oh, you can talk
Or we
another
can do it
time,
now.
but
Okay.
I hope to hear it at the panel too. I'm sorry, Dr. DeShong, it's the hardest part of my job.
Thank you.
Well, my
Pulling the clock slug. Thank you so much, Dr. Steinke.
We're going to change equipment here in about 1 minute. The paper will take 21 minutes, so I'm going to present the paper to you. Hand-wringing over the younger generation is not a new experience. What's different in the 21st century is that we fret over the future. As we fret over the future of our society, is the data. We're no longer dependent on anecdotal evidence and hunches to surmise that things are moving in a downward spiral. We can measure the changes, and the evidence points heavily toward the reality of an extended regressive period in American society, beginning sometime in the 1960s and continuing well into the first decade of this century. Congregational leaders during such times occupy a place of unique influence in the social system. There are more than 53 million Americans on any given weekend who are in houses of worship. 331,000 houses of worship in the United States, to be specific, and they are led by a number of clergy that cannot be estimated. And so the potential influence of this portion of our society is really formidable. E.O. Wilson, recognizing the potential influence in his book Creation, identifies religion and science as, quote, the two most powerful forces in the world today, including especially the United States. Most congregational leaders who would prefer to be part of the solution to the regression often yield to pressure to focus on the symptoms and the issues of the regression, and inadvertently, I think, then contribute to the level of anxiety rather than reducing it. Religious leaders are subject to the same kinds of fears and anxieties as others in the culture. It's unsurprising then that the clergy often join the ranks of the reactive, focusing their rhetoric and their leadership and their political involvement on a few emotionally laden social and political issues such as abortion or homosexuality. The use of the language culture war that's become popular since Pat Buchanan introduced that at the Republican Convention in 1992 further polarizes viewpoints on issues like these and defines those who think differently as enemies. Religion is often co-opted by the polarized representatives of partisan politics. Reactive religious leaders hastily join the parade led by political figures, right or left, and support an agenda of knee-jerk, quick-fix, ineffective legislative solutions focused on society's symptoms. Congregants have their own fears and anxieties reinforced or further stirred as a result, and the regressive societal behaviors continue unabated. The very institutions, including churches, that could be contributing to the progress of society instead contribute to its regression during periods of such cultural distortion. Anxious times require a new way of thinking. Among leaders that can move beyond a focus on symptoms and issues, allowing clergy to lead their congregations and their communities in a more functional direction. Insights from Bowen Family Systems Theory, I think, is one of those sources that can offer clergy a sustainable way forward in the face of crisis and chaos. Bowen Systems Theory has informed practitioners in a wide variety of fields, from family therapy to medicine to organizational life to education and business. If the realm of human relationships is the territory through which one is traveling, Bowen Theory is the map that allows one an opportunity to negotiate that territory more thoughtfully and wisely. In the face of societal regression, where rising anxiety has its impact on the congregation and its life, the families within the congregation, and the clergy as well, Bowen Theory offers a different way of seeing the problems, of seeing one's part in them, and of choosing new ways of responding. Given the challenges of the current regression and the unique position occupied by clergy in this culture, America's congregational leaders have an opportunity to influence their own systems toward better emotional functioning and progress. Higher functioning congregations, clear on their own mission and purpose, vitally connected to their own communities, can extend this progress outward as the ripple effect moves beyond the congregation to families, schools, civic organizations, businesses, corporations, and even perhaps the legal system. But this will require a way of thinking about leadership and about that regression that moves beyond decrying the symptoms and blaming others to taking responsibility for the mission of the congregation and one's own life as a leader. Clergy have a claim to a legacy, I think, that has been left them by the Hebrew prophets who, during times of societal regression, called their people back to the principles of the covenant that bound them to their God. Few of those spokesmen, the prophets, received a hearing from the political and religious leaders of their day who were offering quick fix advice. As Jeremiah the prophet put it, these so-called leaders have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying, peace, peace, but there is no peace. This kind of prophetic posture is not merely railing against the sins of the day, but it is holding up the principles of what is right and whole and healthy by both life and word. Led by principled men and women, faith communities that can model a principled way of holding and a principled way hold the possibility of influencing their immediate environment and creating ripples that can spread through the broader context. What is it that must characterize such leaders and communities? The list is probably quite long. I'm going to underscore simply 3 points of focus that I think are tied especially to my understanding of Bowen theory. The first of those principles is a focus on self rather than a focus on the symptoms of society or the failures of others. Effective leadership in such time will be carried out by women and men who work on the capacity to focus on their own lives, their own thinking, their own roles and responsibility, their own part to play, the log in their own eye, rather than upon the failures of others. They will be leaders who learn to manage their own reactivity to the anxiety of society. I love that picture. I don't know if you can see it, it's dark enough. Those are birds in front of the cat. Self-management is indispensable for the leader in anxious settings. Murray Bowen described such leadership in An Odyssey Towards Science, his epilogue to Michael Kerr's book, Family Evaluation. Bowen described a family leader as one, quote, with the courage to define self, who is as invested in the welfare of the family as in self, who is neither angry nor dogmatic, whose energy goes into changing self rather than telling others what they should do, who can know and respect the multiple opinions of others, and who can modify self in response to the strengths of the group, and who is not influenced by the irresponsible opinions of others. This describes the kind of high-functioning leadership that might offer help to congregations and communities in such times. Regression is stemmed in a family when one family member finally has enough and rises up out of the mess with an I position, saying in one way or another, I believe this family can do better. Enunciating clearly and calmly what one will and will not do, and holding that position in the face of the pressure to return to the previous togetherness of the group, eventually results in the rest of the family functioning at a higher level. Bowen's 8 concept states that the same process would operate in a society. As one leader after another has the courage to function differently, out of differentiation of self, bit by bit, portions of society stand a chance of functioning at a higher level. A better differentiated leader working from the perspective offered by thinking systems will focus on self, on one's part in the situation, on his or her own responsibilities, on the mission or purpose of the organization, and on understanding better the anxieties that underlie the presenting problems or symptoms. In this way, Bowen family systems theory informs the kind of leadership called for on part of the clergy, especially during times of regression. A second principle or idea that's part of this for me is that it is a focus on principles rather than symptoms that is called for. The common reactive tendency of both families and the larger society is to get drawn into a focus on symptoms. That focus is not helpful, however. Friedman noted that when families get fixed on their symptoms rather than on emotional processes, they simply recycle the problems, no matter how much expert advice they receive. The same behaviors that characterize an anxious family abound in a chronically anxious society, including heightened reactivity, increased hurting, blame displacement, quick fix mentality, and a failure of nerve and leadership. These traits subvert the evolutionary processes of human beings and drag society downward. Leadership in such times requires a different focus, away from the symptoms to oneself. Friedman calls for leaders who have the capacity to separate themselves from the surrounding emotional process, the capacity to be clear about their own principles and vision, the willingness to take risks, the persistence to face inertial resistance, and the self-regulation to stand in the face of reactive sabotage. These capacities are found in high-functioning, well-differentiated leaders. One vital aspect of differentiation of self is becoming clear about one's own beliefs, values, and principles. What are those beliefs we hold that we are not willing to negotiate under pressure from those around us? What are the things we both profess and consistently attempt to live? For most, beliefs have been absorbed or imposed but not clearly thought out. Leaders during times of regression especially will need to be clear about their most important principles and will need to live by them even under pressure to compromise. Bowen noted that a high percentage of people trying to define a self will reach out to some set of social norms, such as the Ten Commandments, to, quote, state their beliefs. He said they don't believe what they believe. They believe what they're told they must believe. A well-differentiated leader operates more often on the basis of thought-out principles, beliefs, and values. These core beliefs provide the basis for their decision-making rather than emotional reactions to the anxiety of the group demanding a quick fix or the pressures for togetherness. Congregational leaders come to their task with principles and beliefs that include their own understanding and commitment to various theological and ethical concepts in their tradition. To the degree that these concepts have been personally and thoughtfully appropriated, they provide a means of calling the congregation to consider its own mission, purpose, and values. Otherwise, I think invoking them is as likely to be another emotional reaction to the anxiety of the moment. As congregational leaders, clergy cannot afford to set aside core theological, ethical beliefs as we attempt to provide wise leadership in these interesting times. Clergy who remain connected to their congregation, who think through their own beliefs, seek to live principled lives, and who encourage and coach others in that process as well, can create ripples of maturity that are capable of spreading through the congregation and surrounding community. Clearly, many theological and ethical categories will be helpful to the thoughtful leader and to congregations that take responsibility for changing their part in the anxiety and regression of their own communities by defining their purpose, thinking through their beliefs, and living into them with increasing integrity. The third implication for me of what I read in Bowen's work about societal emotional process, and that has to do with the anxiety that he believed drove that regression. Bowen analyzed the current regression and pointed primarily to environmental sources of the underlying anxiety of the times. The anxiety that drives the regression, he believed, was not generated by the conflict between human beings, such as war. Rather, the conflict between humans and creation lies at the root of the regression. He surmised, based partly on the work of John B. Calhoun, that an exploding human population with its attendant environmental impact was near the source of the problem. Human beings are instinctively aware that the resources needed to sustain life on Earth are limited, and that the rapidly increasing population may soon exhaust such things as arable land, clean water, and petroleum. At the same time, human beings notice the absence of new frontiers in which to spread, begin to feel more fenced in. Additionally, we begin to recognize that the waste products of our unsustainable, consumer-driven lifestyle will not be able to be absorbed by our ecosystem much longer. The constant threats to the planet through elimination of large portions of rainforest, extinction of hundreds of species, the spewing of nitrogen-based agricultural products into our waters, and the atmospheric effects of carbon-based lifestyles of the developed nations are ignored by many. Denial of the threat at the conscious level does not fool the emotional system, however. The threat to our environment is perceived as a threat to our future and survival, and anxiety rises. Bowen suggested that pulling out of the regression would require, quote, a human being who can live in better harmony with nature. What efforts on the part of leaders might move in that direction? How might high-functioning congregational leaders respond to this underlying source of societal anxiety? I run the risk of being taken prescriptively by offering my thinking and suggestions about possible directions to be taken. My caveat is that these are not quick fixes either. These are simply directions that are counter to the one currently pursued by our culture and ones that I'm attempting to build into my own living. These actions must be preceded by thinking, by conviction, by beliefs, and by principles. They need to be incorporated into the lives of leaders, not merely advocated in words. E.O. Wilson, entomologist, biologist, self-designated secular humanist, and author, wrote a book entitled, ironically, The Creation. As a literary device, he addresses the book as if it were an impassioned letter to an unnamed recipient who is a Southern Baptist pastor. The pastor is assumed to be reasonable, devout, and committed to his beliefs. Wilson attempts to persuade this pastor that both the writer and the pastor have a reason to hold a common goal, saving life on the earth. Wilson apparently hopes to engage the leadership of conservative evangelical Protestants in the effort to live in greater harmony with the creation. He tells his imaginary reader, quote, "You are well prepared to present the theological and moral arguments to save the creation. I am heartened by the movement growing within the Christian denomination to support global conservation. The stream of thought has arisen from many sources, from evangelical to Unitarian. Today it is but a rivulet, tomorrow it will be a flood." Responsible religious leaders who accept the environmental analysis of our regression as accurate will employ their role as teacher, preacher to educate congregants regarding the issues of stewardship of the earth. They will think through their own ecology and apply biblical teachings to the current issues. Genesis 1:26 through 30 and 2:15, for example, are suggestive of the human responsibility to, quote, "cultivate and tend the garden in which we've been placed." Genesis 3 narrates the separation between humanity and the creation that is a consequence of humans turning away from God. Many of the agricultural instructions of the Mosaic Law imply responsibility to care for the land. In fact, the concept of the land itself as a gift of God to Israel is a central theme in Hebrew Scriptures. American congregations can learn to appreciate anew the holiness of creation from a biblical perspective. Wendell Berry writes of the way in which an honest reading of Scripture points to a view of the earth that confesses God's ownership of it all, our responsibilities and stewardship of it, and the holiness of creation and all life on it. Berry notes the disconnectedness or disharmony between human beings and creation. This shows up, not least of all, in our disconnectedness from the soil, the supply of our life. Berry describes what he called the industrial eater as one who does not know that eating is an agricultural act, who no longer knows or imagines the connections between eating and the land, and who is therefore necessarily passive and uncritical, in short, a victim. When food in the minds of eaters is no longer connected with farming and with the land, then the eaters are suffering a kind of cultural amnesia that is misleading and dangerous. As an antidote to this disconnection, Berry, a way of living in greater harmony with creation, Berry urges a kind of urban agrarianism in which one acts more deliberately and consciously in regard to food. Bridging the disconnection between the human and the creation might begin with being more mindful about what we do thoughtlessly 3 times a day when we sit down to eat. Reconnecting with the creation may be particularly challenging for those who live in urban and suburban settings. It's the very place where the disconnection is experienced most powerfully, however. As the human population has exploded, so have the extraordinarily large cities around the globe. In 1900, only 14% of the population lived in cities. Today, half the people of the world do, half of 7 billion people. By 2050, 70% of a 9 to 12 billion population will be dwelling in cities. It's easy to imagine how nature or creation becomes a near mythological concept to people whose daily life is filled with concrete, glass, and asphalt. Yet the need to reconnect harmoniously with the creation is more dire in these very settings. Many of the symptoms of the regression, crowding, violence, drug abuse, crime, family distress, pollution, are especially prominent in the cities. One might assume that this disconnect with creation would generate even higher levels of chronic social anxiety in urban contexts. Consequently, the urban and suburban environments might be all the more in need of connection with the soil. In a presentation on societal regression in 2009 in El Paso, Dan Papero noted that in the midst of regression, signs of progress may also be found. One encouraging trend in this decade involves a movement, especially among younger urban and suburban adults, to eat slow. That stands for seasonal, local, organic, and whole. Locally grown produce sold at small and large urban farmers markets and CSAs appear in more and more cities. Schools, churches, hospitals, community associations in cities and towns are developing community gardens. Organic production is on the increase because of consumer demand. Sustainable agricultural processes are being reclaimed, especially on the multitude of small farms across the country. The writings of Wendell Berry, Jane Goodall, Barbara Kinsolver, Michael Pollan, Joel Salatin, and others have helped to place an alternative way of thinking about food before an urban and suburban audience. These and other signs of greater environmental responsibility are cropping up in media and in practice and are marks of some progress. Leaders are rising out of the morass of the regression to offer an alternative way to relate to creation more harmoniously. How might commitments to principles of simplicity reshape the way clergy and congregants live in a world where disconnection between the human and earth results in an irresponsibly consumptive lifestyle? The classic spiritual disciplines of prayer, worship, solitude, and simplicity provide resources for living in greater harmony with the created order. Other responsible ways of living involve using less energy, taking up less land for waste disposal, being frugal with scarce resources such as water, and recycling recyclable materials can serve to bring our lives into greater harmony with creation. Additionally, building recreation into our lives that puts us in contact with the creation ought to be considered as a thoughtful response. Clean parks available in urban inner city areas might be the nearest some people ever come to being out in nature. Congregations may find ways of helping make this connection possible. The question is, what can clergy contribute out of our own thoughtful beliefs and convictions, by our own life and example, by our preaching and teaching, and by our leadership to help us reconnect congregations with the creation in a life lived in greater harmony with it? Whatever we can do might well have an impact not only on the earth and other life forms with which we share, but also on the level of anxiety in our communities, in our culture, as more and more people in our congregations reconnect responsibly with creation. The current regression did not arise quickly, and I skipped over a whole bunch of things that we could have talked about, but I wasn't planning to. So, okay. Did not arise quickly. It developed over decades as anxiety increased, as reactivity heightened, as symptoms appeared, as society reacted to those symptoms with wars on drugs, and wars on poverty, and wars on terrorism, with denial, with superficial agendas, with loud rhetoric, with knee-jerk legislation, and with the failure of nerve to stand for what is needed. We abandoned our principles to silence the demands of the least mature for their rights. Over the years, we elected leaders who promised to fix what is wrong. When they did not or could not, we ousted them for others who promised they would take care of it. We demanded our rights and forsook our responsibilities. We acted out of appetites and instincts rather than out of reason. We exploited the resources of the earth and exploded in numbers. Congregations and their leaders and members were often part of this same soup. All of this took time. The current regression will not end quickly. That does not relieve congregational leaders from the task of responsible influence. Focusing on differentiation, becoming the best version of ourselves emotionally and spiritually as we can, is not optional for leaders during such times. Clarifying and developing our thinking and our core principles, beliefs, and values is necessary, for we will be asked to enunciate those, to take stand on those, and to live consistently in light of them. Asking and answering key theological and ethical questions with our congregations will be part of the process. And if you accept the environmental thesis of Bowen and others as the best explanation of the source of the societal anxiety underlying this regression, then we will learn to connect with creation more responsibly as stewards living in greater harmony with the created order, as leaders and as congregations. And we have 5 minutes.
Just one quick question. Where can we get a copy of your paper?
Email me, I email you. All right. We were talking about this at Victoria's house at a seminar in the spring. I was working on a version of this, and one of the frustrating things to me about this is this sounds simplistic still to my ears. Be careful how you eat, recycling, but things have to start somewhere, and I do believe that influence spreads and ripples like that, and so there are places to begin.
As I was listening to your presentation, is this on?
You may need to turn that on.
Turn that on.
Turn it on. It may be.
There's a switch.
There's a switch. It may need to be turned on.
It's on. I just can't hear it. As I was listening to your presentation, I was just thinking about a book that's coming out. I apologize, I cannot remember the name of it, but if anyone's interested, I can get access to it. But basically, it was talking about how the impact of the immediacy of access to information via the internet, which has been a huge game changer, I think, in terms of our society, how that's led to increased reactivity literally across the world. And one example that comes to mind for me was when a religious figure was depicted in a cartoon in a not very flattering way, and within hours, was rioting and deaths as a result of a reaction to that. And one of some of the research that's been done has been around the idea that when, as human beings, we have access to such immediate information, it leads to impulsiveness and to impulsive decisions. And so I was thinking about that in the context of how challenging it is to be a leader in a society in which, in a very few short years, what used to take at least hours or days for information to get processed and responded to, now literally with the click of a button, I can make a decision to donate to something that I saw as I was surfing the net, or to write to my congressman about something that I don't even know a whole lot about, but one of my friends said, hey, look, you need to talk about this so that this legislation doesn't get passed. So I was just curious about what your thought was around the impact of that on a lot of the things that...
Part of it, yeah, I think, for me, it's as if somewhere in the 90s, I don't think Bowen could have seen this coming the way that it did, but it's as if the whole globe got a central nervous system installed, so that you're right, it's not even seconds, it's just almost immediate reactivity is possible. Congregations find this to be, email and congregations are not good combinations. Things used to take much longer to get through that system too, but they happen pretty quickly now. But you're right, it makes reactivity more immediate. And so yeah, I think that's a part of, it's a neutral tool, but given a reactive and regressive society, it becomes, I think it just spirals faster than that. Thanks.
Thank you.
You can tell any one of these presentations could be the afternoon program. So I appreciate each and all cramming it into 30 minutes, and look forward to the panel for discussion of the ideas stirred.